Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is 𝗵𝗶𝗀𝗄. I am a multi-award-winning author of fantasy, and today I am drawing a chapter header graphic for my upcoming book, Paragon of Shadow. I have drawn chapter headers for each book in this series so far, and I've done them as gouache paintings. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what to do for this particular book because each book has kind of a central magical artifact that plays a major part in the story. And while I did the Sun Shard for book 4 and I knew I wanted to do the Shadowsliver for book 5, I sketched them out on the same page and it wasn't really working for me. So on one very gray and rainy day, I sketched out kind of a prism shape that I liked a little bit better in my sketchbook, and now I am starting the process of digitizing that. I began by taking a photo of my sketch with my iPad and then just converting it to line art by tracing it in Procreate. This is a method that I used for each of the previous artifacts as well to transfer them to watercolor paper. In some of my other books, I've done the graphics digitally, but I just really like the watercolor texture that I get with the gouache paint for these, and it also makes for very fun stickers. After I'm happy with the digital sketch, I print it out and use my light pad to transfer it to the watercolor paper. Having the illumination from the back makes it easy to trace onto the super thick watercolor paper that I would not be able to see through otherwise. This is not a particularly expensive paper, it's just Canson watercolor paper. I've never really done as much traditional media work as I do digital work, but I've really enjoyed having my gouache paints. I use washi tape to stick the paper down on the top of my desk so that it won't move around while I'm painting. This also helps prevent it from wrinkling up too much whenever the paper starts to get wet. This may also be a slightly lower audio quality than what I typically do. I broke my headset this week, so I'm borrowing one from my husband, and the microphone setup is not as good as what I'm used to working with. I bought these little portable palettes with the intention of using them for my gouache paint, but I ended up not actually filling any of the half pans in it yet. I've had it for a couple of months and I just haven't had the time to get to it. So I use my color chart and I pick out a few colors that I think are going to work well and I just put them right onto the palette part. I'm using 2 different colors of purple and some white, and that's all I'm going to use for this artifact. For filming this process, I got out my DSLR that I have not been using for filming much of anything this year because it's starting to get some hot pixels. So there are just like a couple random flecks that might look like dust on your screen. I apologize for that. That's kind of what happens when you use a digital camera to record things for 10 years. Eventually it starts to wear out the sensor. The first time I ever used gouache paint was actually when I painted the first artifact for this book series. So I still have a lot to learn. I don't have a whole lot of time to devote to art anymore. Most of my time goes to writing, but I really enjoy being able to give kind of that handmade touch to all of my books. The colors for this prism are inspired by some little prisms of amethyst that I saw, but I want it to also look like it's, at least a little bit transparent so that you can see the little teardrop flame of magic that is trapped inside. This artifact actually made its appearance in the first book, and it's not until this point in the story, 5 books in, that the characters are starting to realize how important it actually is. I don't want to replicate amethyst too closely, but I do want to have a lot of texture in this. So I kind of dab the colors together to get some interesting blends. And I am using a wet on wet painting method where I have wet down the paper and then I'm adding very wet paint on top of that so that it feathers out and it moves just like watercolor. Gouache paint is more opaque than watercolor, so if I make any mistakes, I can actually go back over this and paint over the top of anything that I get wrong and it will cover up. It contains chalk that you don't get with watercolor paints, so while watercolor is really translucent, gouache can be translucent like watercolor, or it can be opaque depending on how you use it. When you use gouache paint straight from the tube so that it's like really thick, not watered down, it behaves more like an acrylic paint. As I'm working on this, I am not using any kind of reference material, just kind of going off my memory of the impression of what the amethyst crystals that I liked looked like. A lot of them had like a milky quality. There were a lot of inclusions of white and like pale pink. Amethyst is a type of quartz, so it's normal to have those color variations. Any color that quartz can come in also can appear in amethyst. So that's why there's sometimes, an intense purple or a little bit more pink, kind of like rose quartz. You can see how there are some places that it just doesn't go together quite as well as I wanted, but once again, the benefit of the gouache paint is that I can go back and go over it again. I'm trying to emphasize the little lick of shadow magic inside, so it's going to be really dark, and I've got kind of like a little wisp off the top. The whole time that they've had it, it's sort of been this undefined something that they haven't been able to figure out. As I've been focusing on writing this series, I have less and less time to spend doing any sort of artwork, and I've found that I really miss it. I've never considered myself a particularly good or skilled artist, but I think I know enough to get by and at least do things that are interesting. And for things like this, where it lets me do my own custom chapter graphics and things like that, it's a nice hobby to have. But it is something that I would like to spend a little bit more time on in the future, because it's another way to explore the fantasy worlds that I am creating. I am under no illusions that anything I create will be particularly exceptional, but they get the idea across, and I think that's good enough. It's also really nice to have the freedom to do these kind of things for my own books. I've also always thought it would be really fun to do an illustrated book. I remember being young and reading books by 𝗵𝗡𝗍, and she almost always had illustrations or like portraits of the characters that her husband had done that she included as parts of those books. And I always thought, wow, I would love to do something like that, but I think my art skills need to improve a bit before I try to tackle something like that. Especially since it's been so long since I have drawn anything with any sort of regularity. I've become really rusty. This video is sped up a little bit, but the paint dries as I'm going along, but before long I'm going to have to take a little bit longer of a break just to give it more time to dry out so that I can keep layering. As I am doing the white, there are a couple of places where it really feathers out a lot more than I wanted, and that tells me that in some places the paper is still too wet to get the really crisp lines that I'm hoping for. There have been a couple of times where I'm putting in the white highlights that I wonder if maybe I'm going a little bit overboard with them. But in the book, I kind of described the prism as being more like purple glass, so it should be really shiny, a lot shinier than if it was a gemstone. After I get the prism itself all painted and I give it some time to dry, I go back with a brush and you can see I just wet down like along the edges and just really saturate the paper all around because I want to put this like a cloud, I guess, of color around it. This is something that I've done with all of the artifacts, and just that texture that you get from the paint bleeding across the wet page. I have always really liked that, and even though I don't include that part in the books, I like having it on the stickers that I print for myself and use to seal packaging related to these books. I feel like it's just kind of a nice extra something. It sort of gives the impression of like glowing, I think, especially with the white border around the outside edge, because I don't take the water all the way up against the side of the artifacts. And then once I get up to the top, I'm also kind of painting in like some swirls, like drawing water and drawing the brush to make some swirls so that it looks a little bit like smoke or like a rising mist or something. This doesn't always turn out exactly like what I have in mind, but it's just, you know, sort of an impression of something magic coming off of the stone. Whenever I did the illustration for the Molten Dagger, I tried to make it look like heat waves and rising embers, and that was a fun experiment too. Purples are always difficult to photograph. Cameras don't pick them up very well, so there's a little bit of color difference between like what my cell phone picks up and what my DSLR picks up. And then the actual illustration doesn't look like either one of them because the colors are a lot more intense. But this is the final illustration of the prism, the Shadowsliver, and a black and white version of this will appear at the chapter headers for my next book. Hopefully I'll be back next week with more information about the book's pending release. But until then, take care and I'll see you next time.